Hi, I'm Hoodie here, and this is the story of my journey to say goodbye to my favorite retired fortresses before I retire this world and move on to the Steam version of Dwarf Fortress. I generated this world, Jebestar, back in August, before I even had an idea of what I wanted to upload on my channel, and all but one of the Dwarf Fortress stories I have made have taken place in this world. Of those stories, 11 of them took place in my Valley of Retired Fortresses. It was always a good spot to set up where I wouldn't be disturbed too much or have to struggle for survival, and could instead focus on building weird little projects. And so I set out on my adventure to say goodbye to my retired fortresses as a dwarven jeweler woman named Moral, who was immensely strong and had Grandmaster tier swords dwarf skills, so that I wouldn't be killed by dingoes yet again while adventuring. I set off from my old fortress of Simple Fortress, which is not a part of the Valley of Retired Fortresses and is really barely a fortress at all, because I retired immediately after embarking there. But it was close enough to where I needed to go that I would probably only need to sleep one night in the woods on the way there, and the game didn't crash when I pressed Y to go, so it was practically a perfect location. I didn't have much time to stand around and chat with the dwarves I abandoned in Simple Fortress when I spawned in, because I was informed that the town was being threatened by a merciless elven army. It felt like maybe that was my fault for starting wars with 4 different elf civilizations last week, but this is adventure mode, so when the going gets tough, the tough can get going. And so I abandoned the Simple Fortress dwarves once again and headed north over the mountains, towards my Valley of Retired Fortresses. True to my plan, after one night out in the cold, I made it to my nearest retired fortress, the haunted house. It was still full of dead bodies, and somewhat surprisingly, there were still a few people alive talking in the walls. The dwarves in the walls were still not keeping the conversation on spooky topics like I wanted, but I guess that's what you get when you force non-actors to live in the walls. Of course, the candy gem in the basement was missing because I stole that when I first tested it out, but there was an excited patron in the haunted house, a small merchant, who was wandering the halls and told me he wanted more. I guess next year's haunted house will have to be even scarier. Maybe I'll even be able to convince the ghosts to leave the wall people alone next time. And with that, the haunted house was over, and it was time to head to the next location, the roller coaster fortress. When I arrived at the roller coaster fortress, it seemed like people had not been getting the enjoyment out of it that I had hoped for. I thought the excitement of clearing a gap in a minecart would really bring in the migrants, but I guess the toxic working conditions I put everyone through just pushed everyone away instead, because there were not very many people left. I jumped over the magma crossing and walked the track, hoping to find my dwarves admiring my engineering prowess, but instead only found a giant Kia holed up in a small cavern section with one of my stolen artifacts in its clutches. I figured that the bird would probably enjoy holding onto that gem more than I would, so I left it alone. When I came out the other side of the track, the roller coaster fortress was over, and I started the long trek over the plains and rivers to my fortress of mandatory happiness. It was a long enough trip that I had to spend the night in the woods once again. This time my sleep was interrupted though, by 3 dingo men. I took some superficial blows, but ultimately being a Grandmaster Swords Dwarf meant it was pretty short work, and I came out on top. Finally a victory to go alongside the 4 times I've been killed on adventures by dingoes or dingo-based people. When I finally found my way back to the Fortress of Mandatory Happiness, it still looked pretty nice, but it was obviously really empty after a couple years of retirement, and the fact that I melted all of the neutral dwarves before I left. When I went down into the mines though, I found the old militia commander of the Happy Dwarves, and when I asked how he was doing, he told me he was blissful about sleeping in a bedroom. So it seems like my mission of mandatory happiness was a success. I was pleased with that, and so I left the fortress before the ghosts of the 30 dwarves I killed could come out and convince me otherwise. I traveled south from there and found my way to my ultimate cat tavern. The people seemed to have almost all left, along with a good chunk of the cats. Saddest of all was the disappearance of the cougar that I had bought for them to attract visitors to the tavern. Without the cougar, it was no surprise that the rooms upstairs were all empty, but what was kind of surprising was the strange relationship to the cats that the remaining residents had. They were telling them jokes and stories, and even getting concerned when 2 cats headbutted one another. It was a bit odd, but the cats were nice and the people were harmless, so as a business this fort was definitely a failure, but it still turned into a pretty interesting cat cafe if I do say so myself. Once I left the cat cafe, I continued traveling south, past the settlements not made by me, and all the way to the back of the valley, to my longest-lasting fortress in this world, Mountain House. Mountain House was not a one-project-and-done kind of fortress. I stuck around for about 14 years before the project started to get out of hand and slowed down the fortress to near unusability. I knew I was back in Mountain House territory when I started to see piles upon piles of goblin bodies, and then the hole in the ground from the renovations, and then the half-built castle that I had given up on. When I entered the fortress again, it seemed like it had let itself go a little bit. There were still dead bodies on the ground where I had left them years prior, but it was probably the most intact fortress of all my retired fortresses. It was still humming with life, and I could see all of it because I had had all the walls removed during renovations. I went down the stairs to see some of my old projects, and found that the fighting pit was still full of dead bodies from the forgotten beast that I failed to trap. The Dwarven Doctor Test Hospital had dead bodies outside of its doors, possibly due to some extra testing, and the track and field track no longer had exciting goblin races, and instead there was just a single kobold cursed one on it, and it refused to talk to me. Originally I thought I wouldn't be able to get into the old Beak Dog Park because I had blocked it off due to a flooding problem caused by a disappearing floodgate, but I eventually figured out I could get into the park the same way the water did. It took a few tries getting battered around by the water, but eventually I made it to the water distribution floor. From there I jumped into one of the holes in the ground and ended up cannonballing into the Beak Dog Park. To my surprise, it was actually more of a Crundle and Cave Crocodile park at this point, and neither my beak dogs nor my trolls were around. I struggled to swim around for a while and nearly drowned while checking the drain tunnel. It was full, but I couldn't find my beak dogs or my trolls anywhere. After swimming around for a while, I began to notice that the 3 or 4 deep water that had filled the room when I cannonballed in was now more like 5 or 6 deep water, and filling fast. In a last-ditch attempt, I swam closer to the Crundles to see if there was anything I was missing over there, but on my way I was attacked and mortally wounded by the cave crocodile. Eventually I succumbed to the water and drowned, probably in much the same way my beak dogs and trolls had, and it was the end of my adventure. It was nice to reminisce and see some of my favorite forts one last time, but my world, much like an adventurer jumping into a rapidly filling pool without a way out, was now a thing of the past. See you next week in a whole new world and a whole new version of Dwarf Fortress. Thanks for watching.